Chapter 8 addresses the topic of living with limited resources. Now, the focus of this chapter is a lot about policy conflicts that developed over the quantity of resources that we have available for ag use. And of course, the competing populations include, the other 98.5% of the population, and along with farmers with their interests. So combined, limited resources occur because multiple populations have interests in each of them. This chapter will focus on land, water, and endangered species primarily, and we'll take some close look at a couple of the other resources along the way. Now, in a capitalistic society, we oftentimes hear that markets will settle everything. Just let free markets rule. And there's certainly some merits to that. However, in certain resources may not be best for the long-term interests of our whole society. Because farming, especially in ranching, we cannot pass on a lot of the expenses into the product, as we talked about earlier. Economic decisions usually aren't going to consider all the common good because it's not economically feasible to do so. But yet we're supposed to stay in business and do other things. Likewise, broadly in capitalistic systems, we are focused on the entrepreneurial, individual, company outcomes, and doing that, many times there's a lack of access to some of the resources by the greater common group of people. We'll say a little bit more about that. For example, we may own hundreds of acres or thousands of acres or a quarter or whatever, and locked within that, a lot of recreational area possibilities. There's maybe bodies of water involved in there. There might be scenic views. In fact, there may even be, wildlife and such that most people don't get an opportunity to enjoy. That is one perspective or one way of looking at it. Likewise, some people argue that, with the BLM land and some of the federal lands, it's closed off essentially to other people to get a chance to enjoy it in the country. Different states put different kinds of rules in place and laws in place that do provide access for some of this, especially along bodies of water that may go through property. Another example of self-interest is in logging on forest land. Again, businesses can have access to this federal land to do logging, but maybe there's not as much access to other people. So markets and the market system may prevent a lot of people having access to the resources of this great country. All that said, I think we have to entertain the idea that the 98.5%, so to speak, or the majority of people, may have different desires for the use of their resources. And so the questions come up again is, since we have these large landholders, so they perceive in many cases in the hands of as farmers, how do they get a chance to enjoy all this that's a part of this country? And so all that said, how do they get access to enjoying the land? The water bodies that go through there? How about the forests and stuff that are purchased by the farmers and ranchers? The other 98% are saying, you know what, we're paying taxes to help take care of some of the natural resources, but we don't get an opportunity to enjoy them. So what do we think? So the question that comes up here is, what provisions should be made in our society to protect public good related to different aspects of agriculture? And so how does the common person have access? And if so, are these state, local, or federal issues? Everybody's? And then you have to ask, what are the landowners' role? What are their rights? Since they paid for the land, they paid the open market, should or shouldn't they have the ability to keep the gates closed, so to speak, and manage their land without everybody being involved. Well, farmland is a big deal in America and every country, but what drives the policy? Well, number one, in the United States, we say one of our major agricultural policy goals is to produce food and to meet these global food needs. Good, but are there other ways to help meet global food needs? So we've kind of come up with we're seeing sufficient technology for the most part continue to develop, and land-based in this technology in all forms, whether it be in plant food and tillage and transportation and so on and so forth. We're seeming to catch up on that, and there's all kinds of strategies and being put in place in other countries to continue to shrink the number of people that are food insecure. We've got a long way to go, though. But the real biggie is turning out to be, and we heard this 50 years ago, 60 years ago, when I was growing up, do we have enough adequate clean water? And we always heard about there will be water wars. Well, you know what? That might be coming sooner than we anticipated. Another thing that's happened to support the ability to meet our global food needs is that we've entered into all kinds of global marketing organizations such as Mercosur, APEC, Cairns, the EU, a number of these, WTO, all trying to be sure the food gets around the world. So a lot of these things have changed, and of course this is all being impacted because of different food preferences. In the past they were more limited, but as there's become more income, there has become a greater demand for protein around the world too. The other thing that drives farmland policy is at the same time we have these fragile lands out there that arguably some are certainly not being cared for properly, and we've seen what's happened in the rainforests of South America. We've seen what's happened to some of the wetlands, which is kind of a sponge and a filter system for our water on the globe. Some of our prairies and savannas maybe not cared for very well, so there's been an increased attention to these. So what drives the farmland policy? We're also hearing more, and we see this happen in other parts of commerce. How do we open up the land to scenic areas to other people so they too can enjoy them? Is that something we should do? We recognize we're losing a lot of farm ground each year, 2-3 million acres of land being pulled out of production, and yet we're being able to meet our needs. But do we need some different land policy to further protect the farming capabilities of a country as our global populations enclose? Not only is losing the land itself a challenge, but as we continue to change the landscape and plant apartment houses and skyscrapers and other kinds of things, it certainly does have an impact on the culture and the way of transport life and daily life within the area. Well, what are some farmland use? What are those policy options, and what are the consequences? I think we need to be aware that that unquestionably farmland markets are different for production and aesthetic uses. People have different values, and we can dictate what it's going to be, and the values of these impact the actual financial value and use of them also. We note here that zoning laws dictate land use for agricultural, industrial, recreational, and we've seen them put in place. For example, in agricultural zones, we may say in some cases a minimum number of acres, and in order to maintain this land quality around certain communities, you see that. In other ways, we have laws and regulations put in place to talk about livestock facilities, that they have to be so far away from other people and so far away from different locations. And when literally you can write the policy, and it has been written, and it just almost drives our our confinement agriculture finishing operations right out of the geographic areas. Farmland use has also been impacted by the right to farm laws, in which people can farm and not be pushed out because of city ordinances and things of that nature. At the same time, however, if people don't address care of their property and such in the way others, so to speak, want them, they can be considered a public nuisance, and that angle is sometimes used by policymakers to get operations to move. Another farmland use is by purchase of development rights. The government can go ahead and purchase land and pay more for it and take it out of production for wildlife, recreation, open spaces. We need groundwater, recharge areas, and so on and so forth. So we've seen that happen also. So farmland has got lots of use. It's being handled by many different ways here. One of the important considerations to have, where we're at, our land is worth $10,000 to $15,000 an acre, $7,000, $6,000, but it's really not taxed at that level. It has a preferential property tax appraisal, and often based on some productivity potential associated with that quality of land. And that is something that, again, the public is saying that should be taxed differently. And maybe we have the resources to use in different ways to maintain it, and so on and so forth. There's also the economic perspective that comes there. Another farmland use is to retire some of this land into more productive areas and where it can protect for endangered species, wildlife, plant life, water quality, prevent soil erosion or lessen it. And one of those programs we've obviously had, and it's no longer at 39 million, but it's much less. And in the CRP, the land is put away for a number of years, and the government pays that producers a negotiated price in which they take care of the soil, and they take care of any weeds and such that are there. One of the real advantages is it may help with wildlife habitat. And so, anyway, and likewise, we've had wetland reserve programs that from 30 years to permanent easements, and where it's not going to be touched at all in any form of tillage. And of course, the other piece here, farmland use is impacted by cross compliance. Again, if people anticipate getting some funds from the government for other price and supply management system programs, they're going to have to be sure that they comply with all of the environmental things on the farm too. So those are some implications. How is farmland policy? What is it? How is it used? And what are the implications? We went from farmland to water, and I think we have to acknowledge that agriculture is a huge user of water, especially in our irrigated areas. Especially our irrigated areas do a lot of where our orchards are at. A lot of our vegetable production comes through in those systems, and so beautifully managed and such, these crops do feed a lot of Americans and other people from other countries. But U.S. agriculture does use a lot of water, and people are watching. So the questions come to be then in water policy is how and when to divert water from agriculture to community uses. And that may be a community use, may be wildlife habitat. And so that's where a lot of challenges we've heard about in the West in different places. In the same token, if the water becomes a given commodity, farmers and others who can sell this extra, and so this thing is a question of access again. So should the federal or state governments be involved in stipulating water policy? Knowing our history a little bit, the U.S. did get a lot of water policy put in place in the early 1900s as we move more to the West. And so what are some policy options? Well, let's take a look at the nature of water policy, and I'll see if you're involved in a water board, which you could be, at some county or regional level. I mean, what are you going to stipulate? Limited amounts, or how much?